morning, everybody. Welcome to Time with the Bible Live. We're glad that you're here. We've been going through this series of lessons where we're just taking a look at the life of Jesus, talking about different events, different teachings, and thinking about some application for ourselves as we go through here. This morning, we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7, we've been talking quite a bit about John the Baptist and his connection to Jesus. And I got to thinking about this passage, and we'll cover one more passage probably next week. We might not. We might have a special guest on next week. Maybe in a couple weeks, we'll cover another passage about John. But we're going to be in Luke chapter 7. This passage is also, or this section of scripture is also found over in Matthew chapter 11. You can spend your time reading that as well. There's a little bit more here in Luke chapter 7, so that's why we're going to focus our time and our attention there. But Luke chapter 7, we're going to begin there in verse 18. I'm going to go ahead and read some this morning, and then we'll talk about it. Luke chapter 7, verse 18, it says, "Then the disciples of John reported to him concerning all these things. And John, calling two of his disciples to him, sent them to Jesus, saying, 'Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?' And when the men had come to him and said, come to him, they said, 'John the Baptist has sent us to you, saying, Are you the coming one, or do we need to look for another?' In that very hour, he cured many of infirmities, afflictions, and evil spirits, and to many blind he gave sight. Jesus answered and said to them, 'Go tell John the things that you have seen and heard, that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have the gospel preached to them, and blessed is he who is not offended because of me.'" Okay, so it's interesting. John sends two disciples to Jesus. They are his messengers, and he has a couple questions for them. And look at the questions that he asks. Basically saying, "Are you the one or not?" And that's kind of weird. That's a weird question coming from John the Baptist. I thought John knew. I thought John was assured. He said he was. He declared him to be the Lamb that came to take away the sins of the world. He declared it to his disciples. He saw the Spirit descending upon him. He heard John. He heard and declared him to be. He heard God come from heaven, say, "This is my Son, in whom I'm well pleasing." You thought John would already know the answer to this question, and so why is he asking this question? And I don't know. There's a lot of thoughts towards this. Did John think he was mistaken somehow? Is that what happened? There's lots of different answers that people give to this. Some believe that he's doing this for the sake of the disciples. Go and ask him and hear what he has to say for yourselves. That maybe these disciples needed that. There are some who believe that that he's in prison. And because he's in prison, he couldn't see for himself. He heard all these reports about what's going on. And so he sent these disciples to say, "Hey, are you the one that I baptized in the Jordan?" That's an option. But maybe it has something more to do. And here's what I think it is from the context. I think it has more to do with John's situation than that. He's lived his life preaching Jesus was going to come, and he was preparing the way for him. And now he's in prison. He's about to lose his life. He's going to be executed. He's suffering. And maybe he thought that everything was going to be different once the Messiah came. And so what might that do to somebody? That might get somebody to start questioning their own thoughts, questioning their own strong held beliefs. I don't know. That's a possibility in this. And whatever the reason is, how does Jesus answer that question, John's question? Well, you think about what he could have done. He could have said, "Yeah, I'm the Messiah. Go tell him what I said." But instead, what it says he did, it says he started curing infirmities and afflictions and evil spirits, giving sight to people who are blind. He just starts healing people, and then he says, "Go tell John what you saw. Just go tell him what I did." Jesus didn't say, "Hey, listen, just go tell him everything that I taught you or everything that I said with my mouth." He said, "Go and tell." Because you think about it, John would have known what the Messiah was going to be marked by. John would have understood what the Messiah was going, what the Messiah could do. The coming of the Messiah was going to be in part marked by healing. And so Jesus's message is really twofold. Number one, the evidence of the healing. Number two, the message of hope. It's what Jesus didn't say that would have been really comforting to John as well, because Jesus starts quoting Isaiah 35 verses 5 through 6 here, and John would have known what that meant. John would have understood that. John also would have known what came before that. Turn over to Isaiah 35 with me real quick. Let's just take a real look there. We've been studying the book of Isaiah in the community study, and man, it's been really encouraging. There's all kinds of great messages in Isaiah, lots of messianic prophecies that are just really helpful. And so if you kind of look at Isaiah 35 verses 5 through 6, it's kind of in the realm where Jesus is quoting here. But even if you back up to what Jesus didn't say and look at what Jesus, look what came right before that. He says, it says, verse 3, Isaiah 35:3, strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are fearful hearted, be strong, do not fear. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, with a recompense of God. He will come and save you. I think it's helpful. I think one of the things that is most encouraging to John here is what Jesus didn't say, that God would take vengeance on those, that God would take vengeance on those who would try to hurt his people. And so in part, maybe that's part of what Jesus is saying here. But he's trying to stir up John and encourage him in this very difficult circumstance. And I want you to think about that, what that must have been like for Jesus. Because here's John, his cousin, and he's about to be beheaded for teaching the truth, for speaking out against a marriage that shouldn't have happened. And so John's about to be beheaded, and here's Jesus, and they're about to do the same thing to him for preaching the truth. He's about to suffer and die as well. That would have been very hard for Jesus. And later on, Jesus will like take a break after the message comes back that Jesus, or that John had been killed, and that'll be very difficult for Jesus. But I think the point of this is that it's not just what Jesus said. The greater evidence was what Jesus would do. All right, let's go ahead and read the next section as well. Let's begin there, verse 24. This is when the messengers of John departed, he began to speak to the multitudes concerning John. What did you go into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what do you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments? Indeed, those who are gorgeously appealed and live in luxury are in king courts. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, and more than a prophet. This is he whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. For I say to you, amongst those born of women, there is not a greater prophet than John the Baptist, but he who is least in the kingdom is greater than he. When all the people heard him, even the tax collectors justify God, having been baptized with the baptism of John. But the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected the will of God for themselves, not having been baptized by him. Okay, let's stop there. Let's talk about this section of scripture. Okay, so the messengers of John have Jesus' message. They're going to carry back to John, and they're going to tell him what Jesus did. They're going to bring the evidence to him. And Jesus then turns to the multitudes. And what does he start talking about? He starts asking them a bunch of questions. What'd you go to the wilderness to see? Why'd you go there? Did you go to see the scenery? The reeds shaking in the wind. What did you go out there to see? Did you just go out there to see the the spectacle of a man dressed in these fancy clothes, these suits and ties. Why did you go to the wilderness? What did you go there to see? Well, think about this. He talks about a reed shaking in the wind. Maybe that's kind of a comparison to John. Did you go out there to see somebody who's very shaky in what he believes? He just kind of goes with the wind. Well, that's not what John is at all. John is very bold, and John is very a man of conviction in what he believes, isn't he? He's not a man that is tossed to and fro, as the New Testament talks about, a double-minded man whatsoever. He's a man who spoke the truth. In fact, he's about to die for the sake of speaking the truth, speaking out against the marriage of Herod. So you didn't go out to see that. What did you go out to see? And he certainly wasn't a man of luxury. He wasn't a man who wore nice clothes and lived in a mansion and drove a nice chariot. That was not John. John was as humble as they come. I think about that for a minute. That kind of challenges our mindset of the priorities that we set on what we value. Do we value just people because of what they wear? No, John was not that at all. I'd rather have a church full of John the Baptist than people full of just wearing suits and ties. The important part is, what did you go to see? Did you go see a prophet? Yeah, you went to go see a prophet, but he was more than a prophet. In fact, John the Baptist was a man who Jesus or God himself prophesied about over there in Malachi chapter 3. He was the one that was to come to prepare the way for the Messiah, to prepare the way for him. He was God's herald. Prepare the way of the Lord. Make his path straight. Get out of the way. Prepare your lives and your hearts. That's what he was. John the Baptist was more than a prophet. He was one who was prophesied about. But he was a prophet. He was a prophet indeed. He was a mouthpiece of God. But in verse 28, he says, "For I say to you, amongst those born of women, there's none greater than John the Baptist." There's no one greater than John the Baptist living at this point of time. Besides Jesus himself, there's none greater than him. And yet, who is greatest? Who is greater than John? Well, look what he says at the end of verse 28. He says, "But he who is least in the kingdom is greater than he." Think about it. John the Baptist was the herald for the king. Jesus is the king, but he was the herald for the king. There was none greater than him. But yet the one that's greater than him is the one who's part of the kingdom. Think about what we are. We're the church. We're the bridegroom. And he's the announcer. Those who are part of the kingdom, those who humble themselves, are greater than he. This is also a message of just humility, the importance of humility. Those who are least in the kingdom of God are the greatest. Those who are last are the first. It's kind of a message of humility, to humble ourselves. And so when the people heard all of this, they even the tax collectors, they justify God. We're talking about those who had been baptized by the baptism of John. They came out to John in droves, even though John never done a miracle in the day of his life. John was one of the most revered ministers of his time. And they came out to him in droves. But who didn't come out to him? The Pharisees and the Pharisees and the lawyers. They rejected the will of God for themselves. Think about it. John didn't treat them very well. He'd call them a brood of vipers. Who told you about the judgment, right? You brood of vipers. They're like the snakes. When everything's caught on fire, the snakes start crawling out of the pile. John didn't treat them very well. Besides that, we're talking about people who just couldn't see their need for any conversion. They couldn't see their need for the remission of their sins. They didn't see themselves as sinners. All these other people are sinners and they need that, but not them. They didn't need that for themselves. They were not the humble. Those who are greatest in the kingdom are those who can humble and see themselves for what they are, sinners who've fallen short of God's glory. But that certainly was not true of the Pharisees and the lawyers and the religious leaders of the time. All right, let's read this next section and then talk about it. We're going to begin there in verse 31. It says, "And the Lord said, To whom shall I liken the men of this generation? And what are they like? They are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling one another, saying, we played the flute for you. You did not dance. We mourned to you, and you did not weep. For John the Baptist came, neither eating bread or drinking wine, and you say, he has a demon. And the Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look, a glutton, a a babbler, a friend of the tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by all her children. And so he says, what can I compare this generation to? What's their comparison to? He says they're like children playing a game. They're like children throwing fits when people didn't do what they say that they were supposed to do. They want things their way. You know, they played the flute and they expected you to dance. They mourned and they wanted you to mourn with them. They expected you to mourn. They're like children that are complaining when they can't force their friends to do the things they want them to do. They're just not satisfied with anything. John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine. He was too righteous. And so what did they declare? They declared, well, clearly this man has a demon. This man's didn't fit their mold of what they wanted. He was too righteous. And they only declared him to have a demon. But he says Jesus came. He himself came, eating and drinking, and what do you call him? You call him all kinds of things. He's not righteous enough. Not that those things declared righteousness or not, but they just started throwing all kinds of accusation. Look, he's too righteous, and they throw an accusation. Jesus is not righteous enough for them, and so they start throwing accusation. That's what they were like. They were like children who threw a fit when people didn't act and behave the way that they thought they should. They drew lines in the sand, and they expected everybody to fall in line and obey and act the way that they expected them to. See, the truth is, we are to follow the lines that God draws, not the line that man draws. That all kinds of traditions and all kinds of expectations for the ones that for the people. When the people didn't fit those things, they just threw accusation. Oh, they're a sinner. They were never satisfied. And yet there was none greater than John the Baptist, and they declared him to be, amongst men, there was none greater than John the Baptist, and they declared him to be somebody possessed of a demon. And there's certainly none greater than Jesus, not even John himself. And yet they threw all kinds of accusations up against him. Wisdom, God's wisdom declares God's children. God's wisdom is the lines that we ought to live by. Man, there's a lot in that section, and I didn't even touch some of it. A lot for us to think about and consider. Some really challenging things when it comes to John. Some things of, when we are struggling and we're dealing with things, what does that do to our beliefs? And does it cause us to waver at all? Well, I don't think John was one of wavering. I think John just was in a difficult circumstance. Lots and lots of things for us to take from this passage. Hope you can just take this and think about it, kind of use it to meditate on for the rest of the day, at least, maybe the rest of the week. And I hope that was helpful for you. It was helpful for me to go through. Hope everybody has a great day, and God bless.